Welcome everybody to this talk about the new software ABS. My name is Alexander Weber and this is a joint work with my colleagues Elisei, Macoveiciuc and Gunther Reissig. This talk is subdivided into three parts. First, I would like to give a motivation why we developed another tool about symbolic controller synthesis. So I will review the concept of symbolic control and some existing tools. In the second part, use techniques and technical details to the ABS tool are presented, while in the last part, a performance comparison of ABS to other existing tools is given. Now, for the concept of symbolic controller synthesis, we are given a continuous state control problem that involves a sample data plant with nonlinear dynamics, and we are given a specification on it. We would like to synthesize a controller for this control problem. With symbolic controller synthesis, you first transform the original problem to a purely discrete auxiliary problem. This auxiliary problem involves a so-called symbolic model or so-called abstraction, which in some sense approximates the dynamics of the plant. This auxiliary problem is then solved with algorithms. These algorithms depend on the specification that is given. So, for example, for reach-avoid problems, one can use some kind of shortest path algorithms. If this problem can be solved, the solution is called abstract controller. This solution, this abstract controller, is then refined to a controller for the actual plant. The distinct feature of symbolic controller synthesis is that this controller is correct by construction in theory. This means that the controller provably enforces the specification on the closed loop. There is no verification or tuning necessary once the controller has been synthesized. Why I emphasize here in theory? Because this scheme is an algorithmic procedure which is eventually implemented on the computer. On the computer, there are some issues. For example, when computing the symbolic model, here one needs to solve initial value problems. These are solved on the computer with a numerical integration. This integration introduces approximation error. Furthermore, on the computer we have only available floating point arithmetic, which introduces rounding errors. If you do not take into account these errors, you cannot claim anymore that the result returned by the computer is still correct by construction. And indeed, it is the case that none of the currently existing software about symbolic synthesis has the property of being formally correct. And this is our motivation for developing the tool ABS. So formal correctness for ABS means that any controller synthesized by the software is mathematically guaranteed to solve the control problem that is given as input. To achieve this quality is not trivial due to the errors I mentioned before. So we have the approximation errors we need to take care of. We have rounding errors due to finite precision floating point arithmetic. And we already have an error when interpreting the user input. I will give more details to this last point also later. And there is another challenge. The scheme of symbolic controller synthesis already suffers from the so-called curse of dimensionality. That means that the effort required for solving a problem grows exponentially with the dimension of the plant. So for a formally correct computation to be of any practical relevance, it must be as efficient as a numerical computation. Here's a list of currently existing tools about symbolic control. All of them are interesting, all of them have some distinct feature. In this talk I just want to mention maybe the tool ROX here, because it makes heavy use of the so-called interval arithmetic. Using interval arithmetic, you can avoid the errors I mentioned before. Although ROX is a powerful tool, it is still, and it uses interval arithmetic, it is still not formally correct. When you use interval arithmetic, you must be also aware of the fact that interval arithmetic is much slower than ordinary floating point arithmetic. So using interval arithmetic throughout the computation to avoid the previous errors is not an option, because then you lose the efficiency in runtime. Okay, so ABS, to summarize, has the features of being formally correct, so the results are formally correct, and also the algorithms for synthesizing the controller are space efficient in terms of memory requirement during the synthesis. Some more facts about ABS. So it applies to sampled versions of plants governed by the differential inclusion shown here. In particular, the right-hand side can be a finite composition of the common elementary math functions, and the right-hand side may also involve some uncertainty. Measurement errors can be taken into account, and ABS applies to computes abstractions based on feedback refinement relation, which implies that the final controller is just a interconnection of the abstract controller and a simple analog to digital converter. For computing the abstraction, ABS uses uniform grids that are specified by the user, and in the current version also ABS can be applied to reachability specifications or invariance specifications. The discrete problem is solved by on-the-fly methods, so the abstraction is not computed completely, but only parts, and the methods are taken from the recent works of my colleagues. You can see here on the left button. Okay, now to some techniques used in ABS, or to the general structure of ABS. So, roughly speaking, ABS can be subdivided into 4 parts. First, we have the user input, and in the end, ABS returns on success the abstract controller. So while I'll give the details to the internal functions of ABS, I run here this animation here about the interface of ABS. It should just illustrate how the parts of the left figure correspond to the interface of ABS. This is indicated somehow by the colors here. So, okay, how does ABS works? First of all, I want to discuss the yellow part here, which is in which the actual problem is solved. So here is the synthesis algorithm inside. This part relies almost entirely on floating point arithmetic, just as most of the other tools about symbolic control. By using floating point arithmetic here, we can retain the efficiency in terms of runtime of the overall computation. And here also in this block are the space efficient synthesis methods involved that I mentioned before. So now, in order to obtain formal correctness in this solver block here, we have a pre-processing step before. This pre-processing step provides some certain bounds and forwards them to the solver block so that in the end the result of this solver block is formally correct. For example, in this pre-processing step here, we process the right-hand side specified by the user, and we generate code for numerically integrating ordinary differential equations. This we do by standard methods of automatic differentiation. And this code that we obtained is then later used for computing the abstractions. Now, at the same time, we generate code for this formula, code for bounding the numerical error or the approximation error, and code for bounding the rounding error when we evaluate this integration formula on floating point arithmetic. To bound these errors, we use on the one hand interval arithmetic, and on the other hand an external tool called GABA, which is precisely designed for bounding rounding errors when evaluating formulas on floating point arithmetic. Also, throughout here on several locations, we check for numerical overflow, which is also important when you want to claim in the end formal correctness. And then one more little detail here. Here I said before that in the yellow block we use almost entirely floating point arithmetic. The other small part is multi-persistent arithmetic, because there is a pitfall about mathematical functions, and not all functions provided by the standard libraries like math.h are proved to be correctly rounding. For example, the sine function is a function which is not proved to be correctly rounding on the entire domain. So that's why we use analogs from multi-precision arithmetic to obtain a sign function, for example, that is correctly rounding. This is also very important. This is required in order to claim later that the overall computation is formally correct. Okay, now some details to the input to ABS. Already when the user formulates his control problem and he specifies a decimal number, already then a rounding error may occur. For example, if the user specifies the number 1.2, there is a rounding error when transforming this number 1.2 to the set of floating point numbers, because 1.2 already cannot be exactly represented on floating point arithmetic. And therefore it is not an option to allow the user to specify the problem in a common language like MATLAB or C language, because of these rounding errors. These rounding errors must be taken into account in order to claim at the end formal correctness. So that's why we defined a special input language for ABS, and we tried to imitate as much as it was possible the language of the mathematical language of textbooks. And here on the slide you can see an example how one may specify the dynamics that are displayed here in the input language. The same is true for specifications. So as I said, currently ABS supports reach, void and invariance specifications. Both can be in general specified by 3 special sets: target set, initial set and obstacle set, which can be defined as indicated here for ABS. In general, in the input file you can specify finite unions of compact hyperintervals. Then there are some other parameters necessary to be specified, like sampling time. Those can be specified by a keyword value pair. All the details to the input language can be found in the user manual. Okay, finally, some performance comparison of ABS. Here on the left, there is an example about a jet engine plant with an invariance specification. It's two-dimensional. As for the memory requirement, which is here on the horizontal axis, ABS is certainly space efficient. As for the runtime, in this example, it looks like the pre-processing step of ABS takes quite a long time. But actually, when the complexity of the problem increases, the time spent on the pre-processing step is negligible. This can be already seen on the example here on the right. This is a 3-dimensional example about a robot maneuver and a reach void specification. Here you cannot graphically distinguish between the runtime for the pre-processing step and the overall runtime. And again, space efficiency is also quite obvious. And now to summarize for runtime, we can say that ABS is at least comparable to the other existing tools, and taking into account that ABS is the only tool being formally correct, this fact is quite remarkable. Okay, that's all I wanted to say. Thank you very much for your attention, and I would be happy to answer your questions.